What George Strait said about Reba McEntire moved everyone. No one ever imagined that the king of country had been keeping such a painful secret about Reba McEntire for more than 3 decades. Until now. The spotlight blazed down on the pristine stage of Nashville's Grand Ole Opry House, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors that had witnessed country music's greatest legends. The audience of 2,000 held its collective breath as George Strait, the undisputed king of country music, stepped up to the gleaming microphone. His weathered cowboy hat sat perfectly on his graying head, and his pressed white shirt reflected the stage lights like armor. But something was different tonight. Something in his steel blue eyes suggested this wouldn't be another routine acceptance speech for another well-deserved award. The 71-year-old legend gripped the edges of the podium with hands that had strummed guitars through 6 decades of heartbreak and triumph. His voice, usually steady as a metronome, carried an unfamiliar tremor as he began to speak. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight I need to share something I've kept locked in my heart for 39 years. The packed auditorium fell silent, so quiet you could hear the soft hum of the television cameras capturing every moment for millions of viewers worldwide. In the front row, Reba McEntire shifted uncomfortably in her sequined emerald dress, her auburn hair catching the stage lights. She had no idea what was coming, but the serious expression on George's face made her stomach tighten with anticipation. Around her, country music royalty leaned forward in their seats. Keith Urban exchanged glances with his wife Nicole Kidman. Carrie Underwood clutched her husband's hand. Even the seasoned veterans like Dolly Parton seemed to sense that something extraordinary was about to unfold. George cleared his throat, his eyes scanning the crowd before settling on a spot just above their heads, as if looking into the past itself. Back in 1986, I was nobody. Just another wannabe cowboy with a guitar and a dream that seemed to be slipping away faster than sand through my fingers. His voice grew stronger with each word, drawing the audience deeper into his story. I want to tell you about the night someone saved my career, my family, and quite possibly my life, without me even knowing her name. Before we continue this incredible journey together, I want to invite you to become part of our community. If this story is touching your heart, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know where you're watching from tonight. Your support means everything to us, and together we can celebrate the beautiful moments that remind us why country music is more than just songs. It's about real people, real emotions, and real connections that last a lifetime. The camera operators adjusted their angles, sensing they were witnessing television gold. George's publicist stood in the wings, her clipboard forgotten as she watched her client venture into uncharted territory. This wasn't in his prepared remarks. This was raw, unscripted truth about to spill across the biggest stage in country music. Picture this, George continued, his voice painting vivid images for his captivated audience. A 24-year-old kid from Pearsall, Texas, driving a beat-up Ford pickup with more rust than paint, pulling into Nashville for what felt like the 100th time. My wife, Norma, had just given birth to our son, George Jr., and the hospital bills were stacking up like hay bales after harvest. We were living in a tiny apartment that smelled like cigarettes from the previous tenant, and I was playing honky-tonks for tips that barely covered gas money back home. He paused, letting the weight of those memories settle over the room. In the audience, several younger artists nodded knowingly, remembering their own struggles in Nashville's unforgiving music scene. The city that made dreams also had a reputation for crushing them without mercy. I had written this song. George's voice dropped to almost a whisper, forcing everyone to lean in closer. It wasn't like anything else I'd ever written. It came from the deepest part of my soul, watching my newborn son sleep in his crib, wondering if I was failing him by chasing this crazy dream instead of taking that job at the bank back home. Tears began to well up in his eyes, and he didn't bother to hide them. The song was called Daddy's Promise, and it was about a father swearing to his child that no matter how hard life got, love would see them through. The emotional weight of his words began to ripple through the audience. Hardened industry executives found themselves reaching for handkerchiefs. Reba's eyes widened as she began to piece together fragments of a memory from decades past. Her hand instinctively moved to cover her heart, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by the cameras focused on her reaction. But there I was, George continued, his voice gaining momentum like a freight train gathering speed, facing the hardest decision of my young life. The electric company had sent their final notice. The landlord was threatening eviction. Norma was trying to be strong, but I could see the fear in her eyes every time she looked at our baby boy. I had exactly $37 to my name and a guitar that I'd bought second-hand from a pawn shop in San Antonio. The Grand Ole Opry House had never felt more like a church than it did in that moment. George Strait, the man who had sold more than 100 million records worldwide, was stripping away every layer of his superstar persona to reveal the scared, desperate young man he had once been. It was vulnerability on a scale rarely seen in the polished world of entertainment. "I made a decision that broke my heart," George said, his voice cracking like thin ice under pressure. "I decided to sell Daddy's Promise. It was the most personal thing I'd ever written, but it was also the only thing standing between my family and disaster. I took that demo tape to every music publisher on Music Row, hoping someone, anyone, would see enough potential in it to pay me enough money to keep the lights on for another month." The silence in the auditorium was deafening. Even the technical crew had stopped their usual bustling activity to listen. This wasn't just another celebrity anecdote about the good old days. This was a man bearing his soul, sharing the moment when everything hung in the balance between dreams and reality, between hope and surrender. George looked directly into the camera, his eyes now flowing freely with tears that caught the stage lights like diamonds. Little did I know that somewhere in Nashville that night, a young woman with a voice like honey and a heart bigger than Texas was about to change my life forever. I had no idea that Reba McEntire was listening to my demo, and I certainly had no idea what she was about to do next. The mention of Reba's name sent a visible shock through the audience. All eyes turned to the country music icon who sat frozen in her seat, her face a mask of surprise and growing emotion. She seemed to be traveling back through time, remembering something that had been buried in the busy years of her own rising career. "What happened next," George said, his voice now steady with the gravity of his revelation, "would not only save my career, but teach me the true meaning of kindness, generosity, and the invisible threads that connect us all in ways we never imagine. But to understand the full impact of that moment, you need to know just how close I came to giving up everything." George Strait took a deep breath, his knuckles white as they gripped the podium. The memories he was about to share had been locked away for so long that speaking them aloud felt like opening a vault that had rusted shut. "The rejection was crushing," he continued, his voice carrying the weight of those long-ago defeats. "I must have knocked on 50 doors that week, carrying that demo tape like it was my last hope, which in many ways it was." The audience remained captivated, hanging on every word as George transported them back to those desperate days. In the wings, his longtime manager shook his head in amazement. Even after decades of working together, he had never heard this story in such vivid detail. "There was this one publisher," George said, his jaw tightening at the memory. "Big shot named Harrison Caldwell, who ran Maple Street Music. He had a corner office with gold records covering every wall, and when I walked in with my worn-out boots and my demo tape, he looked at me like I was something the cat dragged in." George's voice took on a bitter edge that surprised even those who knew him well. He listened to maybe 30 seconds of Daddy's Promise before he stopped the tape and laughed. A collective intake of breath swept through the auditorium. Even Reba found herself leaning forward, her heart aching for the young man George had been all those years ago. He said, and I'll never forget these words as long as I live, "Son, this is Nashville, not some backwater honky-tonk. We don't peddle sentimental garbage about daddies and babies. You want my advice? Go back to Texas and find yourself a real job, because you don't have what it takes to make it in this business." George's voice cracked slightly, the old wounds still tender after all these years. Then he threw my demo tape in the trash can without even rewinding it. The silence that followed was deafening. Several audience members wiped away tears, and even the hardened music industry executives looked uncomfortable. This level of cruelty was familiar to anyone who had tried to make it in Nashville, but hearing it from someone of George Strait's stature made it somehow more shocking. "I walked out of that office feeling lower than a snake's belly," George continued, his voice barely above a whisper now. "I sat in my truck in that parking lot for 2 hours, just staring at the steering wheel, wondering if maybe he was right. Maybe I was just fooling myself. Maybe I was being selfish, chasing this dream while my wife and baby boy needed stability, needed a man who could provide for them properly." The cameras caught Norma Strait in the audience, tears streaming down her face as she remembered those difficult early days. After 47 years of marriage, She had never seen her husband share such personal pain so publicly. When I got home that night, George's voice grew stronger as he pulled himself back from the brink of that old despair. Norma was waiting up for me. She took one look at my face and knew it had been another bad day. But instead of saying what any reasonable person might have said, instead of suggesting maybe it was time to give up and move on, she put her arms around me and said, "Tomorrow's another day, George. Your voice is a gift, and the right person is going to recognize it when the time comes." The mention of his wife's faith in him drew a warm smile from George for the first time since he had begun his story. But tomorrow turned into next week, and next week turned into next month. The bills kept coming, and the opportunities kept disappearing. I was down to my last 3 demo tapes, and Daddy's Promise was the only song I had that felt special enough to maybe, just maybe, change our lives. George paused to take a sip of water, his hands trembling slightly as he lifted the glass. The audience waited patiently, sensing that the most important part of the story was yet to come. "It was a Thursday evening in late October," he resumed, his voice taking on the cadence of someone recalling a dream. The leaves were turning colors, and there was that crisp smell in the air that always made me homesick for Texas. I had just finished a set at a little club called the Broken Spoke, playing for maybe 15 people and making enough in tips to buy gas for the drive home. I was packing up my guitar when this young woman approached me. Reba McEntire shifted in her seat, her heart beginning to race as distant memories started to surface from the depths of her mind. She was pretty in that natural way that doesn't need makeup or fancy clothes, George continued, his eyes softening at the memory. She had long auburn hair and the kindest eyes I'd ever seen. She told me she'd been listening to my set, and she asked if I had any original songs. When I mentioned Daddy's Promise, she got this look on her face like she'd been waiting her whole life to hear those words. The audience was completely absorbed now, transported back to that small club in 1986, where destiny was about to reveal itself in the most unexpected way. She introduced herself as Rebecca, George said, and several people in the audience gasped as they began to put the pieces together. She said she worked in the music business and wondered if I'd be willing to let her hear the demo. I almost didn't give it to her. I only had 2 copies left, and I was planning to try some of the smaller publishing houses the next day. But something in her voice, something in the way she asked, made me trust her. George's voice grew quiet again, filled with wonder at the memory. She listened to that song right there in the club, using one of those little cassette players with headphones. And I'll never forget what happened next. When the song ended, she looked up at me with tears in her eyes and said, "This isn't just a song. This is a prayer. This is love made into music." The emotion in George's voice was mirrored in faces throughout the audience. Country music had always been about real emotions and real stories, but this was something deeper, something that transcended the usual boundaries between performer and audience. "She asked me if the song was for sale," George continued, his voice gaining momentum as he approached the heart of his revelation. "I told her the truth about our situation, about the bills and the baby and how desperate I was. She listened without judgment, without pity, just with this incredible compassion that seemed to radiate from her like warmth from a fire." The cameras captured Reba McEntire as recognition dawned fully across her face. Her hand moved to cover her mouth, and her eyes filled with tears as the memory of that night 39 years ago came flooding back with crystal clarity. "She told me she'd like to buy the publishing rights," George said, his voice now filled with the same wonder he must have felt that night. "She said she couldn't promise anything, but she believed the song deserved to be heard. When I asked what she was willing to pay, expecting maybe $200 or $300, she said something that nearly knocked me off my feet." The tension in the room was palpable. Even the camera operators seemed to hold their breath as they waited for George to continue. "She said, 'I think $5,000 would be fair.'" George's voice cracked with emotion. $5,000. It might as well have been $5 million. It was more money than I'd ever seen at one time in my life. It was enough to pay off our debts, keep the lights on, and give me time to keep pursuing my dreams. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Even by today's standards, $5,000 would be generous for an unknown songwriter's demo. In 1986, from a struggling young musician, it was nothing short of miraculous. But that wasn't the most incredible part, George continued, his eyes now locked on Reba McEntire, who was openly crying in the front row. The most incredible part was what she said next, and what she did after she said it, because that moment changed everything. not just for me, but for the entire trajectory of country music history. George's voice trembled with emotion as he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small weathered piece of paper. The cameras zoomed in as he unfolded it with the care of someone handling a priceless artifact. "She handed me a cashier's check for $5,000, he said, his voice barely audible over the collective gasp from the audience. "But along with that check, she gave me something even more valuable, something I've carried with me every single day for 39 years. He held up the yellowed piece of paper, and the giant screens throughout the auditorium displayed its contents for everyone to see. Written in delicate handwriting were the words that had sustained George Strait through his darkest moments. "Your voice is a gift that the world needs to hear. Don't give up now. The best is yet to come. A friend who believes in you." The auditorium erupted in a mixture of gasps and applause, but George raised his hand for silence. I stood there in that little club, holding this note and this check, and I started crying right there in front of her. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I cried like a baby, because for the first time in months I felt hope again. Reba McEntire was sobbing openly now, her mascara running down her cheeks as the memory of that night came flooding back in vivid detail. She remembered the young man's desperate eyes, the way his hands shook when he talked about his newborn son, the raw emotion in his voice when he sang that beautiful song about a father's love. I asked her why, George continued, his voice growing stronger. Why would she pay so much for a song from someone she'd never heard of? Why would she take such a risk on a nobody from Texas? And what she told me next has stayed with me through every success, every failure, every moment of doubt I've ever had since that night. The audience leaned forward collectively, desperate to hear the words that had changed George Strait's life forever. Even the seasoned country music veterans in the crowd seemed transfixed by the raw authenticity of the moment. "She looked at me with those kind eyes," George said, his own eyes never leaving Reba's face in the audience. "And she said, because music isn't about business or money or making it big. Music is about touching people's hearts, about being there for them when they need it most. Your song made me think about my own daddy, about the promises he made to me when I was little. If it can do that for me, it can do that for others. And the world needs more of that kind of love." A profound silence fell over the Grand Ole Opry House. These weren't just words about a business transaction or a lucky break. This was a testament to the power of human kindness, the kind of generosity that expected nothing in return, but gave everything anyway. "But then she said something that really floored me," George continued, his voice filled with wonder even after all these years. "She said, 'I have just one condition for this purchase. I want you to promise me that if you ever make it big, if you ever become successful, you'll remember this moment. And when you see another struggling artist who reminds you of yourself right now, you'll find a way to help them too.'" The cameras captured the reactions throughout the audience. Seasoned music industry professionals were wiping away tears, remembering their own struggles and the people who had helped them along the way. Younger artists looked inspired, understanding for the first time the deeper responsibility that came with success in the music business. "I promised her I would," George said, his voice firm with conviction. "I gave her my word that night, and it's a promise I've tried to keep every single day since. But here's what I didn't know, what I couldn't have imagined in my wildest dreams. Rebecca wasn't just some kind stranger who happened to be in that club that night. Rebecca was Reba McEntire, already one of the most promising young voices in country music." The revelation sent shockwaves through the audience. Even though many had begun to suspect the truth, hearing it confirmed was still stunning. The cameras focused on Reba, who had composed herself enough to nod through her tears, acknowledging the truth of George's story. "I didn't find out her real identity for 3 years," George continued. 3 years during which my life completely changed, thanks to that $5,000 and the hope that came with it. I was able to pay off our debts, keep our apartment, and most importantly, I was able to keep believing in my dream. Within 6 months, I had signed my first record deal. Within a year, I had my first hit single, and it all started with the kindness of someone I knew only as Rebecca. The emotional weight of the story was becoming almost overwhelming. This wasn't just about two country music stars. This was about the invisible acts of kindness that shape our world, the moments when one person's generosity becomes another person's salvation. "But the story doesn't end there," George said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. Because what Reba did next was even more extraordinary than what she had already done, and it taught me something about integrity and character that I've never forgotten. He paused to take another sip of water, his hands steadier now as the weight of sharing this long-held secret began to lift from his shoulders. The audience waited with rapt attention, sensing that the most powerful part of the story was still to come. 2 weeks after she bought Daddy's Promise, George continued, I got a call from her manager. He told me that Miss McEntire had decided not to record the song after all. He said she felt it was too personal for her to sing authentically, and she was returning all rights to the song back to me. No charge, no strings attached. Another collective gasp echoed through the auditorium. The generosity was almost impossible to comprehend. Not only had Reba paid far more than market value for the song, but she had then given it back without recording it, essentially making it a gift of $5,000 to a struggling musician she barely knew. I was confused, George admitted. I called her manager back and asked if there had been some mistake. He assured me there wasn't. He said Miss McEntire wanted me to know that the song belonged with my voice, not hers. She said she had only bought it to help me through a difficult time, and now that I was back on my feet, the song should go back to where it belonged. The cameras caught several audience members shaking their heads in amazement. This level of selflessness was rare in any industry, but in the competitive world of country music, it was practically unheard of. So I had my song back, George said, but more than that, I had a lesson in what it meant to be truly generous. Reba could have recorded Daddy's Promise and probably had a hit with it. She had the voice, the talent, and by then, the growing fan base to make it successful. Instead, she chose to give it back to me, believing that it would mean more coming from the person who had lived it. George's voice grew quiet again, filled with the reverence of someone recounting a sacred memory. I reworked that song, changed some of the lyrics, adjusted the melody, and it became Baby Blue. My first #1 hit, the song that launched my career and changed my family's life forever. But none of it would have happened without Reba's belief in me and her incredible generosity. The mention of Baby Blue sent a ripple of recognition through the audience. It was one of George Strait's most beloved early hits, a song that had introduced him to country music fans across the nation. To learn that it had grown from Daddy's Promise, the song that Reba had rescued from obscurity, added layers of meaning to a song that millions already considered special. For years I wanted to thank her publicly, George said, his eyes finding Reba's again across the crowded auditorium. But every time I tried, she would ask me not to. She would say that what she did wasn't for recognition or praise. She said it was just what one musician should do for another, and she preferred to keep it private. Reba nodded through her tears, remembering the conversations they had shared over the years about keeping their secret. She had always believed that true generosity was meant to be private, that the moment you started talking about your good deeds, they stopped being good deeds and became something else entirely. But tonight, George said, his voice rising with emotion and determination, with Reba's permission, I wanted the world to know about the woman who saved my career, who taught me what it means to lift others up, and who has been not just a colleague, but a true friend for all these years. The audience was on its feet now, applauding not just for George's revelation, but for Reba's extraordinary act of kindness decades earlier. The cameras captured her gracious wave through her tears, her characteristic humility shining through even in this moment of public recognition. But there's more to this story, George said, raising his voice above the applause, because what happened next would test both our friendship and our understanding of what it really means to support each other in this crazy business we call country music. The applause gradually died down as George's words hung in the air, promising yet another twist in this already extraordinary tale. The audience settled back into their seats, but the energy in the room remained electric. Everyone could sense that the story was far from over, and that perhaps the most challenging part was yet to come. Fast forward to 1992, George continued, his expression growing more serious. I had been blessed beyond my wildest dreams. Baby Blue had been followed by hit after hit. I had platinum albums, sold-out tours, and everything a country musician could hope for. Meanwhile, Reba's career had exploded too. She was becoming the undisputed queen of country music, winning award after award, breaking barriers for women in our industry. The cameras panned across the audience, capturing the faces of music industry veterans who remembered those golden years of the early 90s. when both George and Reba were at the height of their creative powers and commercial success. But success in Nashville can be a double-edged sword, George said, his voice taking on a more cautionary tone. The higher you climb, the more people want to tear you down, and in 1992 someone tried to use our secret against both of us in the most vicious way imaginable. A murmur rippled through the audience. This was clearly heading into territory that neither George nor Reba had ever discussed publicly before. The vulnerability in George's voice suggested that whatever had happened had left deep scars on both of them. There was a music journalist named Marcus Fenwick, George said, and several industry insiders in the audience visibly recoiled at the name. Fenwick wrote for one of the biggest country music magazines at the time, and he had a reputation for digging up dirt on artists and using it to destroy careers. He was the kind of person who believed that tearing others down was the same thing as building himself up. George paused, his jaw tightening as he recalled the painful memories. Somehow Fenwick had gotten wind of our story. Not the beautiful truth that I'm sharing with you tonight, but a twisted, ugly version that he had concocted to serve his own purposes. The tension in the room was palpable. Even those who had never heard of Marcus Fenwick could sense from George's tone that they were about to hear about someone truly despicable. In March of 1992, George continued, Fenwick published an article with the headline, "The Secret Deal That Made the King." In it, he claimed that my entire career was built on a lie. He suggested that Reba and I had been secretly involved in a romantic relationship, and that she had essentially bought my career for me as some kind of payment for services rendered. A collective gasp of outrage swept through the auditorium. The cameras caught Reba's face contorting with disgust and remembered pain. Even decades later, the memory of such vile accusations clearly still stung. The article was full of innuendo, half-truths and outright lies, George said, his voice rising with righteous anger. Fenwick had taken the basic facts of our story, that Reba had paid me for a song early in my career, and twisted them into something sordid and shameful. He questioned my talent, my integrity, and my marriage. He portrayed Reba as someone who used her position to take advantage of struggling male artists. The audience was riveted by George's account of what was clearly one of the most painful episodes in both singers' careers. Several people were shaking their heads in disgust at the journalist's tactics. The article came out on a Tuesday, George said, his voice dropping to a more personal tone. By Wednesday morning, my phone was ringing off the hook. Radio stations were pulling my songs. Concert promoters were cancelling shows. My record label was reassessing their commitment to my career. In less than 24 hours, everything I had worked for over 6 years was crumbling around me. The pain in George's voice was raw and immediate, as if he were reliving those terrible days all over again. In the audience, his wife Norma was crying quietly, remembering how close they had come to losing everything they had built together. But the worst part, George continued, was what it was doing to Reba. The article didn't just attack her professionally. It attacked her character, her reputation, her standing as a role model for women in country music. She was getting death threats from people who believed Fenwick's lies. Her own record label was pressuring her to distance herself from me publicly. George's voice cracked slightly as he remembered the toll the scandal had taken on his friend. I called her the day after the article came out, ready to tell her that I would publicly deny everything, that I would take full responsibility and try to clear her name, even if it meant destroying what was left of my own career. The audience was hanging on every word now, completely absorbed in the dramatic retelling of this crisis that had threatened to destroy 2 of country music's biggest stars. When Reba answered the phone, George said, a small smile beginning to play at the corners of his mouth, I started to apologize, started to tell her how sorry I was that my problems had become her problems, but she stopped me before I could get 2 words out. The smile on George's face grew wider as he recalled what was clearly a pivotal moment in their friendship. The cameras focused on Reba, who was nodding through her tears, obviously remembering the same conversation. She said, George Strait, don't you dare apologize for 1 second. We know the truth, and that's all that matters. Anyone who would believe the garbage that man wrote doesn't deserve to be our fan anyway. Then she said something that I will never, ever forget as long as I live. The auditorium was so quiet that you could have heard a pin drop. Everyone was waiting to hear the words that had obviously meant so much to George during his darkest professional hour. She said, you stood by me when I was nobody, believing in my music before anyone else did. Now I'm going to stand by you no matter what it costs either of us, because that's what real friends do. That's what real artists do. We support each other, we lift each other up, and we never ever let the small-minded people win. The power of Reba's words, even filtered through George's retelling 33 years later, sent chills through the audience. This wasn't just about two celebrities supporting each other. This was about integrity, loyalty, and the kind of friendship that transcends fame and fortune. That weekend, George continued, his voice growing stronger and more determined, Reba did something that showed me what true courage looks like. She called a press conference, not to distance herself from me, not to deny our friendship, but to tell the world exactly what kind of man Marcus Fenwick really was. The audience leaned forward, eager to hear about what was clearly going to be a moment of triumph over adversity. She stood up in front of a room full of reporters and photographers, George said, his voice filled with admiration and gratitude, and she told them that yes, she had helped me early in my career. She told them that she had bought one of my songs because she believed in my talent. She told them that any suggestion of impropriety was not only false but insulting to both of us. George paused, looking directly at Reba with an expression of profound respect. But then she said something that changed everything. She looked straight into the cameras and said, "If helping a talented artist achieve his dreams is somehow wrong, then I'm guilty as charged, and I'd do it again tomorrow for George Strait or any other deserving musician who needed a helping hand." The audience erupted in spontaneous applause, but George wasn't finished. "She didn't stop there," he said, raising his voice above the noise. "She challenged Fenwick directly. She said that anyone who would try to destroy careers and friendships for the sake of selling magazines was everything that was wrong with the music industry. She said that real journalists build up the art form instead of tearing it down." The applause grew even louder, as the audience appreciated not just Reba's defense of George, but her broader defense of artistic integrity and mutual support within the music community. "Marcus Fenwick never wrote another article about country music," George said with obvious satisfaction. Within 6 months he had been fired from the magazine and had left Nashville entirely. The truth had not only set us free, it had exposed him for the fraud he was. George's voice grew quiet again as he approached the end of this part of his story. But more importantly, Reba's courage in standing up for the truth, in risking her own career to defend our friendship, taught me something about what it means to be not just a successful artist, but a good human being. He looked out over the audience, his eyes scanning the faces of the next generation of country music stars. "She showed me that success means nothing if you're not willing to use it to lift others up. She showed me that friendship isn't just about the good times, it's about who stands with you when the whole world seems to be against you." The emotion in the room was overwhelming. This wasn't just a story about overcoming scandal anymore. It was a masterclass in loyalty, integrity, and the power of standing up for what's right, regardless of the personal cost. "And that brings me to tonight," George said, his voice rising with anticipation, "because after 39 years of keeping this story mostly private, after decades of quiet gratitude and behind-the-scenes friendship, I finally have the chance to do something that I've dreamed of doing for most of my adult life." The entire Grand Ole Opry House seemed to hold its breath as George Strait reached the culmination of his extraordinary revelation. The emotional journey had taken the audience from despair to hope, from betrayal to triumph, and now they sensed they were about to witness something truly special. "Ladies and gentlemen," George said, his voice carrying the weight of nearly 4 decades of gratitude, "I want to invite someone very special to join me on this stage. Someone who saved my career when she didn't have to, who stood by me when it would have been easier to walk away, and who has shown me what it means to be not just a great artist, but a great human being." He extended his hand toward the audience, his eyes locked on Reba McEntire. "Reba, would you please come up here?" The audience erupted in thunderous applause as Reba, still wiping tears from her eyes, made her way to the stage. She moved with the grace of someone who had walked these boards countless times before, but there was something different about this moment. This wasn't just another performance or another award show appearance. This was the public acknowledgement of a friendship and a bond that had shaped both their careers and their lives. When Reba reached George's side, he embraced her warmly, and the cameras captured the genuine emotion passing between two people who had shared so much history together. The applause continued for what felt like minutes, a standing ovation that acknowledged not just their individual achievements, but the beautiful story of friendship and generosity they had just shared with the world. "Reba McEntire, ladies and gentlemen," George said into the microphone, his arms still around her shoulders. "The woman who taught me that success isn't measured by how high you climb, but by how many people you lift up along the way." Reba stepped closer to the microphone, her voice still thick with emotion. "George, you have embarrassed me tonight in the most wonderful way possible," she said, her words drawing laughter and more applause from the audience. "But I want everyone here to know that what I did all those years ago wasn't special. It wasn't heroic. It was just what anyone with a heart would have done when they heard that beautiful song and met that determined young man." She turned to face George directly, her eyes shining with tears and affection. "What's special is what you did with that opportunity. What's heroic is how you've used your success to lift up countless other artists over the years. You've kept that promise you made to me in that little club in 1986, and you've done it with a grace and generosity that I've been privileged to witness for nearly 4 decades. The emotion in Reba's voice was matched by the emotion in the audience. This wasn't scripted or rehearsed. This was 2 old friends sharing a moment of truth and appreciation that had been building for most of their adult lives. "But I want to tell you something else," Reba continued, her voice growing stronger. "That song you wrote, Daddy's Promise, it did touch my heart that night, but what really made me want to help you wasn't just the song. It was the love I heard in your voice when you talked about your baby boy. It was the determination I saw in your eyes when you talked about not giving up on your dreams. You reminded me of why I fell in love with music in the first place." George nodded, remembering that night and the conversation that had changed everything for both of them. "Reba, you gave me more than money that night," he said. "You gave me hope. You gave me the chance to prove that small-town dreams could come true. And more than that, you showed me what it looks like to be successful with dignity and grace." The audience was completely absorbed in this intimate conversation, playing out on the biggest stage in country music. Many were crying openly, moved by the raw authenticity of the moment. "I have something for you tonight," George said, reaching into his jacket pocket again. This time, he pulled out not a piece of paper, but a small, elegantly wrapped box. "Something I've been saving for the right moment for a very long time." Reba looked surprised as George handed her the box. She opened it carefully, and when she saw what was inside, her hand flew to her mouth and fresh tears began to flow. The cameras captured her reaction and projected it on the screens throughout the auditorium, showing the audience a beautiful pendant shaped like a musical note, studded with diamonds and clearly crafted with exquisite care. "This pendant," George explained to the audience, "was made from the original recording equipment that captured the demo of Daddy's Promise all those years ago. I had it crafted into this piece specifically for Reba because I wanted her to have something that represented the moment when our friendship began and when my career was saved." Reba was overcome with emotion as she examined the pendant more closely. "George, this is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," she managed to say through her tears. "But you didn't need to." "Yes, I did," George interrupted gently, "because for 39 years, I've wanted to find a way to properly thank you for what you did. Not just the money, not just the opportunity, but for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself, for standing by me when others tried to tear us both down, for showing me what real friendship looks like." The audience was on its feet again, applauding not just the gesture but the deep friendship it represented. This was country music at its absolute finest. Real people sharing real emotions about experiences that had shaped their lives. "But I have one more surprise," George said, and the audience settled back into their seats with anticipation. "Reba, would you be willing to sing something with me tonight?" Reba's eyes widened with surprise and delight. "What did you have in mind?" she asked. George smiled, and it was the kind of smile that suggested he had been planning this moment for a very long time. "I was thinking we could perform Daddy's Promise together for the first time ever, the song that started it all, performed by the 2 people whose lives it changed forever." The audience erupted in the loudest applause of the evening. This was beyond anything anyone had expected when they arrived at the awards show that night. They were about to witness the premiere performance of the song that had launched George Strait's career and cemented a friendship that had lasted nearly 4 decades. 2 guitars were quickly brought out on stage, and George and Reba took their positions. The lighting dimmed to create an intimate atmosphere, and the thousands of people in the auditorium fell completely silent. George began with the opening chords, his fingers finding the familiar patterns that he had played thousands of times over the years, though never publicly. When he began to sing, his voice carried all the emotion of a young father's love for his child, all the hope of a struggling artist believing in his dreams, and all the gratitude of a man whose life had been changed by unexpected kindness. When Reba joined in on the harmony, her voice blended perfectly with his, creating something magical that neither of them could have achieved alone. The song told the story of a father's promise to always be there for his child, but in the context of everything that had been shared that evening, it became something larger, a promise between friends, a commitment to supporting each other through all of life's challenges and triumphs. As the final notes faded away, the silence that followed was profound. Then slowly the applause began to build, becoming a crescendo of appreciation that seemed like it might never end. People were standing, crying, cheering, and celebrating not just a performance, but a friendship that had enriched both their lives and the entire country music community. When the applause finally began to subside, George stepped back to the microphone one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to end tonight with a promise," he said, his voice strong and clear. "The kindness that Reba showed me 39 years ago changed my life forever. It taught me that success is meaningless unless you use it to lift others up. So tonight, I'm announcing the creation of the Reba McEntire Foundation for Emerging Artists, a fund that will provide support for struggling musicians who just need someone to believe in them." The audience rose to their feet once again, applauding not just the announcement, but the perfect way George had found to honor his friend and continue the cycle of kindness that had begun so many years ago. "This foundation will do what Reba did for me," George continued. "It will find artists who have the talent and the heart but lack the opportunity, and it will give them the chance to prove themselves. Because that's what this business should be about, not tearing each other down but building each other up." Reba wiped away fresh tears as she realized the full impact of George's gesture. He had taken her act of kindness from decades ago and transformed it into something that would help countless other artists for generations to come. "Thank you all for listening to this old cowboy's story tonight," George concluded, his arm around Reba's shoulders once again. "Thank you for celebrating not just our careers, but the friendship that has meant more to me than all the awards and accolades in the world. And thank you for reminding me why I fell in love with country music in the first place. Because it's about real people, real emotions, and real connections that last a lifetime." As George and Reba waved to the audience, the standing ovation continued for several more minutes. The cameras captured the faces in the crowd, showing seasoned industry professionals and young artists alike, all moved by the story they had just witnessed. The evening had begun as just another awards show, but it had become something much more significant. It had become a testament to the power of kindness, the importance of friendship, and the beautiful ways that one person's generosity can ripple through time to touch countless other lives. As the curtain finally began to fall, George Strait and Reba McEntire stood side by side, two legends of country music who had shared their most personal story with the world, and in doing so, had created a moment that would be remembered and celebrated for generations to come.